Junior tore open the letter with a tremor in her hands, rain hammering the tin roof as the candle guttered and spat a scent of melted wax into the dim parlor. The paper smelled faintly of cedar and ink, the handwriting familiar and cold as iron. A draft sneaked under the door, carrying the distant roar of a distant cannon and the closer, more intimate crackle of the hearth grate, where another log sighed against the cold. The letter began with a name, Alden Hart, written in that careful engineer's hand she had once traced on a ledger as a girl, before war and hunger and distance had hijacked their quiet world. But it was the second line that struck her like a winter branch shattering a pane. If I do not return, marry my brother. The moment she read it, Junior felt the room tilt. Her heart drummed a memory she tried to suppress, the way Alden had looked at her the last time he stood on her porch. Mud-smeared boots, a smile that never reached his eyes, and the smell of tobacco smoke and rain on his coat. He had spoken of duty, of a war that would soon swallow the valley whole. He had pressed a folded slip of paper into her hand, an ordinary page, ordinary ink, so ordinary that the words carved themselves into her mind like frost onto the glass. If I do not return, marry my brother. Junior, a voice called from the hall. And she started, the candle's flame throwing a small, guilty halo over the wall. It was her mother, May, a woman who wore quiet like a shawl and kept the ledger books with a woman's stubborn patience. May placed a palm on Junior's shoulder, the warmth of a summer day in a place that had learned to bend toward winter. Is it the letter? May asked, her voice a thread in the cold air. Junior did not answer at first. She looked at the lines of Alden's handwriting and the faint watermark where the paper had been pressed against a seal. The words swam before her eyes. If I do not return, marry my brother. She felt a weight settle in her chest, something like a stone in a well, something that would not shift no matter how she tugged at it. Do you understand what he asks of me? Junior said at last, though she knew May already did. The question was not a request for permission. It was a rip in the fabric of a future that would not be hers if she refused. I understand war makes men cross lines they'd never cross in a warm room, May said, choosing the phrase carefully, as if it could hold back the current of fate. But Junior, you must live with what you choose. You must live with what you are given. That night, in a house that felt suddenly smaller, Junior weighed the parchment in her hands as if it might crumble into dust if she pressed too hard. The candle wavered, and the room smelled of smoke, damp wool, and the faint sweetness of honey from a jar May kept for visitors. The world outside, the mules stubbed in the byre, the distant guns, the lines of wagons and smoke began to intrude upon the parlor like an uninvited storm. The days that followed moved with a gravity Junior had not anticipated. News traveled by rider, and by whispered report carried on the wind, a wind thick with the iron taste of blood and rain and fear. Alden Hart's name drifted through the valley like a flag on a dark hill. He was gone, lost, somewhere near the James, or somewhere in the wilderness, or perhaps at a hospital in a town she could not pronounce on a map. The war did not pause for her, and the letter's demand did not soften with time. It sharpened, a fixed blade in a wooden sheath. The decision to marry Alden's brother arrived not as a fanfare, but as a quiet, practical calculation. Micah Hale, tall with a stubborn jaw and the same stubborn set of shoulders Alden wore when he spoke of honor, stood with his mother, a grave, almost ceremonial solemnity in the parlor, when May announced the plan to the surrounding family. Junior could not see the entire room at once. Faces blurred into rough shapes. An uncle with a cigarette, a cousin with muddy boots, a girl who braided her hair too tightly as a sign of nerves. But she could see the glint of a wedding ring, a glimmer in Micah's eyes that felt more like a claim than a union. Marry my brother, the letter had written, and the words had thudded in Junior's chest, beating a rhythm she could not outrun. The idea of replacing one life with another, of walking into a new bed and a new bedspread and a new name, did not feel like a choice so much as a duty, a moral gravity she could not ignore. If she refused, she might fight the war in her own way, but a life without Alden would still be a life diminished, a root pulled and left to dry in a crumbling garden. The wedding took place under a sky bruised with winter light, an ordinary ceremony in an ordinary church, with people who spoke softly, because the soldiers' guns had taught them that loud voices carry more than just sound. The church's organ coughed, the pews creaked, and the scent of lilac from a nearby hedge drifted in as the married couple swore the oaths that bound them to a pledge neither had asked for, and both would bear as a burden. Junior wore a gown of heavy cotton, the fabric swallowing her shape as if she were already less a woman and more a memory someone would one day forget. "Do you take Micah Hale to be your husband?" the minister asked, the question rehearsed in his voice as he looked at Junior, with the careful kindness of a man who had learned to hide fear behind his collar. "I do," Junior said, though the words felt as hollow as a dried husk as they came from her mouth. She did not crave the ritual. She craved the truth of Alden's death, the truth of that line in the letter, the truth that might come if she did the thing she was told. When the kiss that sealed the ceremony warmed her lips, Junior felt a small triumph in the victory of simple acts, a kiss that tasted faintly of lemon from a pie the family had baked to celebrate. It was not a triumph she could hold long, though. The room began to tilt again, and she saw in the faces around her a mix of relief, pity and something else, guilt perhaps, or fear of a future that the town could not quite name aloud. Rising action began to unfurl in a steady, almost gentle rhythm after the wedding. The war did not abate. If anything, it pressed closer, a memory that would not stay only in the past. Junior moved between house and shop and church, as if she were a thread weaving through the fabric of a wounded nation. The letter's instruction threaded through every decision she made, as if Alden's last request had become her compass needle, forever pointing in a direction she could not resist. In the days after the ceremony, Junior learned to speak with Micah in the careful, clipped tones of a household that wanted to keep its innermost gears from grinding. He spoke not of affection, but of property, of stewardship, of a duty to maintain the name and land that Alden had once hoped would pass to Junior. "Do you remember your promise?" Micah asked once when the rain pelted the kitchen windows, turning the glass to a mosaic of watery stars. His voice was not loud, but it was as certain as a hammer strike on an anvil. "I remember a letter," Junior said, meeting his eyes with a steadiness she did not feel. "I remember a line written in the ink of a man who did not return. A man who did not return because he believed his cause was just, and that you would be cared for," Micah returned, the edge in his tone barely veiled. "If you wish to honor him, there is a way to do that without bitterness and without a stain on his memory." Junior did not respond with passion or anger. She felt the weight of Alden's memory pressing into the room like smoke from distant fires. The air smelled of tea leaves and damp wool. The clock ticked with a measured, almost mournful patience, as if time itself understood the gravity of this new life she had inherited without consent. The next portion of rising action arrived in quiet, almost unremarkable forms. A paper in a parish ledger that didn't quite match her memory of Alden's assignments. A name spoken by a neighbor with a tremor in the voice. A rumor about a letter Alden wrote from a field hospital that mentioned his vow to leave Junior a friend in his brother's care if he could not return. A rumor grows like a night-blooming plant, at first small and sweet, then thick with scent and poison. One rainy afternoon, Junior walked along a lane that cut through the village like a scar. The air carried the iron tang of rain on the road and the smoke of nearby chimneys, and her feet kicked at stones that jutted from mud, as if trying to find a way to stand in a world that would not stand still for her. An old friend from the farm, a man named Elias, stood under the eaves of a storehouse, his hat brim soaked and clinging to his forehead. "Junior," Elias called, stepping out into the rain with a wary grin. "You've kept out of sight since the wedding. People talk about you when you pass the cider mill, you know." "I keep myself busy," she answered, her voice even, though the rain made it hard to hear. "There is much to do and less time in which to do it." Elias looked at her with that mixture of pity and relief that comes when someone minds their own business but still wants to offer a hand. "The boy you married, Micah, is not Alden's brother by blood, is he? But he carries that same stubborn, unbending look that Hart wore when he spoke of duty." Junior kept her eyes on the muddy road, listening to the distant drum of cavalry and the closer, more intimate sound of rain on the roof of the shop. "Duty," she said softly. "Duty is a door that never closes, Elias. The war is a door that never closes." She did not tell him what she suspected, that in the rooms where doors closed in the night, a different truth walked in, a truth about life, about becoming a wife to the brother who would never truly be her brother, about the possibility that a man who would one day kill Alden might really want to kill Alden's memory too. She carried these thoughts like a heavy, wet cloak. And she did not throw it off. The investigation that followed was not a formal procedure or a courtroom drama, but a series of sharp, small tests of memory and motive. Junior began to notice little things. An unaccounted-for bruise on Micah's shoulder that would appear and vanish. The way a bottle of Alden Hart's medicine had gone missing, exactly when a trusted neighbor said she had seen Micah at the Hart home. The way one of Alden's maps had moved from the shelf to a cabinet she could not access without Micah's permission. There was never a direct accusation. The town's memory is a stubborn thing. It folds events into patterns the mind can bear. But Junior's mind was trained to accept a line of reasoning she barely tolerated in ordinary times. That love can be a defense against a world that makes no sense. That memory can become a sword if used correctly. And that sometimes a person's worst act is not the first act of a villain, but a painstakingly assembled mosaic of small choices that lead to a large, irreversible outcome. Her nights were filled with a kind of quiet war, the war inside the house, where the walls held their breath as if listening to the pulse of a double life, the life of a wife to Micah and the life of a widow to Alden. In the dawn of each day, she would awaken to the memory of Alden's letter, the sting of his promise carried through the parchment, the sense that a larger, unseen stage was being built around her. The climax of the story arrived with a night that tasted of rain and iron and the cold, clean fear that follows a truth revealed too late. It began with a knock on the door, a rhythm of knuckles against wood that was faint but insistent. Junior opened to find a man she did not fully know, an older soldier's friend, a nurse from the hospital, a serviceable, careful kind of stranger who spoke in a voice that never rose above a whisper. "Miss Junior," he said, glancing over his shoulder, as though expecting someone to burst through the door from the other side. "I've come because I owe you a truth you deserve to hear." "Speak," she said, gripping the edge of the doorway as if it were a lifeline. The man stepped into the hall, his shoes making a soft sound on the planks. He carried a bundle beneath his arm, the kind of bundle that holds truth but also the weight of consequences. "Alden Hart did not die in a battlefield that most people remember," he began, his words careful, each syllable a measured step toward a precipice. "He fell into a trap, engineered, I fear, by a man who stood at his side with a ready smile and a ready alibi." Junior's breath caught. The neighbor's rumor sounded like a ghost in a windstorm, but the man's tone, calm, almost unswervable, made the idea take root in her mind with a cruel certainty. "The hospital records," the man continued, "showed a sudden decline after a night when Hart's wagon broke down a mile from where his regiment slept. The doctor who treated him, a man named Dr. Calder, wrote of a complication of wounds compounded by fatigue and poor nourishment. The official statement said Hart died of his injuries, but there was a second voice in the room that night, a voice that did not belong to the medical staff, a voice that declared Hart's death was not an accident of fate. It was a deliberate act." Junior's hands trembled, the bundle he carried lifting slightly. In it lay a packet of letters, Alden's letters, and a single piece of correspondence written long after Hart's departure. "Read," the man said, his eyes a careful, anxious minefield of cautions. "Read the letter that Hart wrote from the field hospital, the one he entrusted to a friend who swore to guard it until the day you would need it most." She unfolded the letters with a careful, almost ritual reverence, the paper stiff with ink that had begun to fade, but still burned with a stubborn clarity. The lines were Alden's, their rhythm the same steady cadence that had walked with him through the long days of service and the longer nights of waiting. There, among the sheets lay the confession, a brief, clipped admission tucked into a corner, and aside a note to a friend, a way of telling the truth in a language someone would have to understand. It was not in bright ink. It was not a blazoned statement of guilt. It was a small, almost clinical note that the man who had died would never know the truth about his murder. The confession did not arrive as a single thunderclap. It arrived as a sequence of moments that added up to the same terrifying reality. The friend who found the note did not imagine that he would become the instrument through which a life would be measured against another life. The friend swore that Hart had spoken of a plan and a person, that he had spoken of the brother who would inherit the future if Hart were not to return. The friend, hearing the tremor in Hart's voice, had sworn to keep the word until the time it would no longer matter. But it mattered. Junior sat with the bundle on her lap, the night leaning in, the room's breath shallow, the rain tapping a guessing drum on the window pane. She could hear the distant murmur of the town, the men's voices in the tavern, the murmured prayer for safety in a church not far away, the clock in the hall marking time with a slow, inexorable tick that sounded like a judgment. When she finally spoke, it was not to condemn, but to ask a question she felt too late to ask, and too early to know the answer to. Was Hart's memory protected by his vow, or was it used as a shield for a crime committed in the shadow of war? The man who carried the confession looked at her with a heavy gentleness. That is for you to decide if you choose to see it as more than a grievance. He paused, as if listening for someone who might interrupt this moment with a proof or a denial. Hart's brother, Micah Hale, killed him on purpose. It was not a mistake. It was planned. And Hart's memory would never rest until someone spoke that name aloud in truth. The room seemed to shrink around Junior, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. A slow, terrible clarity settled over her like frost on a window pane. The taste of iron filled her mouth. The air grew sharp with salt. The walls grew too close, like the bad moment when a person realizes a door will not stay shut. The confrontation, the climactic moment of the tale, followed soon after. Junior asked to see Micah. The family's housekeeper led her to the back room where Micah often spoke to his horse on quiet evenings, a space where furniture stood stark, and the air carried the scent of clean wool and the damp breath of a horse in a stable outside the door. Micah was there, seated at the table with his cup of tea cooling in front of him, his hands resting on the wood, as if he had been waiting for Junior to come and lay bare the truth. "You were not content," Junior began, her voice quiet and steady, like a blade drawn from its sheath but kept for a future moment. "You did not enjoy the memory of a life that would have given you nothing you did not already possess. You took a life to secure a memory for yourself." Micah's lips tightened. "Hart left you a line of duty," he said, his tone clipped. "He never said I would kill him, Junior. He asked you to marry me, to keep his name intact. You did not accept the line of duty. You accepted a line of inheritance." Junior's eyes found the floor. "Was Hart's memory more important than his life?" she asked, almost to herself, though the room would have heard had it possessed ears. "The truth cannot be undone by words," Micah replied, though his voice betrayed a tremor, a flicker of fear that tugged at the corners of his mouth. "But I will not deny what I did. Hart died because I could not bear the fear of losing you to him, or to the war, or to another life that might not be mine." Junior's breath came hard, and she raised her head, meeting his gaze with something she did not know how to name. "You speak of fear," she said, "but fear is not a blade you can wield with a single reckless stroke. Fear is a chain you forge in your own heart, and then use to pull another life toward you." The confession came not with a roar, but with a careful, precise candor. The voice of a man who had rehearsed his lines for some time, and found them adequate enough to justify what he knew to be wrong. He spoke of a plan laid in the weeks after Hart's departure, how Hart's secure position in the field hospital offered an opportunity, how a powder-tinged night in a camp, where the drums could be heard across the river, provided cover for an act that would be attributed to the chaos of war, and how his motive was to protect the future he believed he and Junior deserved. Junior listened, the letters in her lap growing heavier with each word, as though the paper itself was absorbing the truth of what had happened, and then refusing to release it. The room's air grew colder as the confession unfolded. The night outside pressing close, the river behind the house whispering its own dark sounds, water brushing against stone, a distant moan from the current, as if the land itself was listening. Junior's senses were alert, as if the entire world had become a single instrument in a slow, deadly symphony. She could feel the dust on the shelves, the roughness of the wood against her fingers, the heat of the stove that had once kept her warm, and now seemed to burn with a cold green light. Yet even as he confessed, Junior found herself compelled to ask another question, one not only for the killer, but also for the living who still bore the weight of a life cut short, and a vow that had pressed a particular consequence. "And to the present moment, why?" she asked, her voice firm and clear, though her throat burned with the effort of restraint. "Why would you kill him? And then tell me, as if memory were a verdict you could control." Micah looked away, toward the door that led to the corridor and out into the living world that would not stop for their confession. He spoke with an odd, almost defeated softness. "I do not expect forgiveness," he admitted, "but I cannot bear the thought of passing the rest of my days knowing the truth remained hidden, as if the dead could forgive what the living had done." The air between them held that taut silence, heavy as a winter sky about to crack with a storm. Junior weighed the words, feeling the letters line again. The instruction that had set her on this path, the line that had forced her into a life she had not chosen. In her mind, Alden Hart's voice rose in memory, a ghostly echo that rose with the cadence of a march. The resolution of the story, following the confession, was a quiet, unglamorous reckoning more than a dramatic triumph. The village did not erupt into riot or judgment. Instead, there was a slow, stubborn consensus that some truths cannot cleanse the stains of blood, but can illuminate the deeds that led to them, so that people might live with the memory in some small, careful way. The aftermath did not look like a courtroom or a battlefield. It looked like a farm at dawn, fields slick with dew, the smell of damp earth, a kettle gently steaming on the stove, a neighboring boy practicing a tune on a cracked fiddle, and Junior standing at the window with the same letter Alden had written long ago in a time when he believed his words could save them all. She found herself returning again and again to the letter, the one that began the chain of events that would define the remainder of her days. The line, "If I do not return, marry my brother," had been spoken to her as a command and an offer, a duel between love and loyalty, a decision that she had not sought but had learned to harness as best she could. She did not forgive Micah instantly, and she did not forget Alden's life or his promise. She did not forget the weight of his words or the burden of the truth that his brother had woven into their marriage and his memory. In the weeks that followed the confession, Junior worked to stabilize the household, keep the farm's life moving, and ensure that the memory of Alden Hart held a place within the family that was honest and difficult, but not entirely hopeless. She spoke with May, with Elias, with a pastor who did not pretend to have all the answers, but offered quiet counsel about atonement, forgiveness, and the possibility of a life built from the broken pieces of a single, terrible truth. The war did not end with this confession, but it did end one way in Junior's life, with a new, precarious sense of what the truth could do, what memory could do, and what a vow could still demand, even when the vow's original owner could no longer see the world clearly. The valley would remember Hart only as one man, who left behind a girl who became a wife and a mother, to a memory she could never quiet entirely, and a brother who confessed a crime with his breath held tight in his chest, a confession delivered in the stillness of a room where the fire burned low and the night held its breath, and in the end, the confession was given and received. Micah Hale's voice broke when he spoke the last words. His confession not a thunderclap but a quiet, painful murmur that carried through the room and into the night like a falling leaf. "I killed him on purpose." The words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of what they meant, and what they could never undo. Junior stood very still, the letter clutched in her hands once more, but now not as a weapon or a burden, but as a relic of a long and complicated truth, a record of the line that Hart had drawn in the sand, an act that would be remembered not as a demand, but as a memory that could be faced. Her life moved forward from that moment, not in triumph, but in a sober acceptance of the path she must walk. She remained in the valley with the farm's lines in her hands, and the memory of a man who had loved her enough to ask for his future, to be protected even after his death. The war outside pressed on. The guns outside the village walls continued to thunder in the distance, and Junior's home became a place where truth was spoken, not with the flair of a dramatic revelation, but with the quiet, steady courage of a woman who refused to let the memory of her husband be defined only by loss. The ending, as the story closes, remains faithful to its exact concept, a soldier's letter that asks a partner to marry his brother if he does not return, the partner's compliance, and the brother's confession that he killed him on purpose. The confession is spoken, the truth is named, and the memory of Alden Hart is carried forward into the living world by Junior, who learns that love is not a shield against murder, but a reckoning that must be borne with honesty and with the hard-won courage to face what has happened. In a nation at war with itself, and with the idea of what makes a life worth saving. In the quiet hours after the confession, Junior stood at the kitchen window, watching the wind move through the bare trees. listening to the distant whistle of a train carrying news she would never quite trust, and feeling the weight of the past settle into her bones. The room smelled of tea leaves and smoke, and the damp sweetness of rain on copper, the kind of scent that only a long silence can preserve. The war roared on somewhere beyond the valley, a loud and terrible reminder that memory, like war, never truly ends, but it can be faced with a stubborn grace. And so, the story ends where it began, a letter, a vow, a wedding, a confession, a truth spoken at last. Junior's world did not return to its old shape, but it did grow legible in a new, brittle way. The way a manuscript becomes clearer only after an editor has pressed the page to the light and read the words aloud. The memory of Alden Hart, the memory of the Brothers' Act, and the memory of Junior's choice to live with the truth would remain the chapters of a life that